history remembers Louis XIV, the Sun King, as a ruler of immense power. A man who reigned longer than any other monarch in European history. A living god cloaked in gold, who built the Palace of Versailles not just as a royal residence, but as a stage to broadcast his divine authority. He stood at the center of his realm, radiant, untouchable, and absolute. But few know the real story of how he died, alone, decaying, and ultimately human. This is not the story of military conquest, lavish court spectacles, or sun-drenched gardens. This is the story of what came after all that glory had faded, when the golden mask cracked, and the truth beneath it began to rot. Literally. Louis XIV believed himself to be the embodiment of the state. L'état, c'est moi. But even the state could not shield him from the slow invasion of death. In his final days, the most powerful man in Europe was brought to his knees by disease, trapped in a body that was betraying him, surrounded by courtiers who whispered of succession and watched his decline like spectators at a grotesque theater. In the end, there were no trumpets, no divine ascension, only the stench of gangrene, the tremble of withered limbs, and the horror of a man facing the ultimate truth, that even the sun must set. This is the terrifying tale of Louis XIV's final days, a descent into darkness, rot, and remembrance. By 1715, Louis XIV was approaching his 77th birthday. For over 7 decades, he had survived wars, revolts, court intrigues, and personal tragedies. He had outlived his son, his grandson, his brother, and many of his closest allies. But he could not outlive his own flesh. The beginning of the end came not with a dramatic collapse, but with something deceptively mundane, a persistent pain in his left leg. At first, it was dismissed as gout or rheumatism, common afflictions for a man of his age. But soon, the pain grew sharper, more constant, and ominously hot to the touch. By late August 1715, the king could no longer walk without help. Physicians, who were more court flatterers than medical experts, hovered nervously. When they finally examined the leg closely, they found blackened skin around the shin, foul-smelling and cold. The diagnosis, belated and whispered, was gangrene. The irony was cruel. Louis XIV, the man who ruled a nation with absolute precision, was undone by rotting tissue. There was no sword, no assassin, no uprising. Just necrosis, his flesh dying while he still lived. Still, the king tried to maintain composure. He insisted on attending his duties, propped up and carried from chamber to chamber like a marionette. His attendants sprayed perfumes to mask the growing stench. His courtiers bowed and flattered him, while secretly recoiling at the smell of decay. Even as his leg turned darker, as blisters wept pus and the pain reached intolerable levels, Louis refused amputation. "At my age," he reportedly said, "it would be a useless prolonging of suffering." Whether it was stoicism or stubborn pride, he chose to face death with the same theater that had defined his life. But beneath the regal mask, cracks were spreading. He began to speak of his sins, to reflect on divine punishment. After decades of seeing himself as a chosen vessel of God, he now wondered if God had withdrawn his favor. He summoned confessors, spoke of the innocent blood spilled in wars of ambition, and questioned his legacy. His appetite failed. His sleep was broken by fevers. Hallucinations began to stir. He once dreamed he was drowning in black water as unseen hands pulled him down. It is said that he murmured prayers not for strength, but for forgiveness. The court watched nervously. Whispers of death spread down the polished marble corridors of Versailles. His heir, a 5-year-old great-grandson, was already being tutored on how to rule. Ministers debated what would come next, while outwardly insisting the king would recover. But everyone, especially Louis, knew that recovery was no longer possible. His body had declared war against him, and the sovereign was losing. By the final week of August 1715, the Sun King had become a rotting relic in silk sheets. The gangrene had spread beyond his leg, invading his groin, his abdomen, even the tissue around his spine. The palace walls, once echoing with harpsichords and formal declarations, now carried a different sound. Moans, the wet rattle of labored breathing, and the low, discreet panic of his physicians. The royal bedchamber was not a place of peace. It had become a chamber of horror. The gangrene stench, sweet, cloying, and sickening, could no longer be masked by perfume or incense. Servants fainted. Courtiers avoided eye contact. The body of Louis XIV, once displayed in paintings as marble perfect, had become bloated, mottled with dark green lesions. His belly distended. His limbs began to swell, tight with fluid, until even silk sheets irritated his raw skin. Then came the screams. The pain, even with opiates, became unbearable. At times he begged for more laudanum, at others he cursed it for clouding his mind. His cries, punctuated by sudden silences, terrified those who waited nearby. Some whispered that he spoke to ghosts. Others said he argued with angels. On certain nights, Louis reportedly believed he was being dragged down into the earth, his bed swallowed by dirt and worms. He cried out for his mother, dead for over 50 years. At one point, he demanded to know why his dead children stood at the foot of his bed, silent and judging. Whether it was sepsis-induced delirium or the culmination of a lifetime's suppressed guilt, the king was clearly haunted. His courtiers, terrified of contagion and scandal, began to rotate in shifts, spending as little time near him as duty required. His heart began to fail. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. Doctors tried to force nutrients into him, but he could no longer keep food down. The proud monarch who once sat for 4-hour dinners now gagged on broth. Despite the outward collapse, he occasionally tried to perform his kingly duties. He called ministers, gave instructions for the regency of his young heir, and muttered political observations, though his voice was fading fast. It was as if he hoped one last performance might redeem him. A modern physician, looking back, would almost certainly diagnose him with multi-organ failure, systemic infection, and advanced necrosis. But the court could only interpret his decline through superstition and whispered fatalism. "The king is dying," they murmured in corners of Versailles. "The sun is going out." His mental state mirrored the physical. There were moments of lucidity, flashes of regal clarity, but also long stretches of terror. He feared judgment, both divine and historical. He feared being forgotten. And more than anything, he feared that his death would prove his mortality, shattering the myth he had so carefully constructed. In those final days, he was not a god. He was not a son. He was a man, sick, swollen, rotting, and afraid. Versailles was a palace built on choreography. Every gesture rehearsed, every silence filled with meaning. But as Louis XIV lay dying, the mask of ritual began to slip. Behind the gilded doors, the court turned its gaze not toward the king, but beyond him. With the monarch's body decaying upstairs, plans were quietly unfolding downstairs. Ministers and advisors, ever watchful of legacy and survival, began preparing for the future. The Sun King's heir, his 5-year-old great-grandson, the Duc d'Anjou, had already been styled Louis XV. Tutors were summoned. Guardians were appointed. Regency councils were formed. The dying man was still breathing, but politically, he had already been moved aside. His once loyal family, too, kept their distance, sometimes out of grief, more often out of calculation. His surviving relatives, including the manipulative and ambitious Duke of Orleans, circled the situation like carrion birds, vying for power in the coming regency. The court, full of sycophants who had once orbited Louis like planets, now looked to a new center of gravity. Meanwhile, access to the king became a tightly controlled spectacle. Only carefully selected visitors were allowed into the royal sick room, and even they were expected to treat the experience as sacred theater, not a tragedy but a transition. Those who entered and witnessed the rot were expected to say nothing. Versailles could tolerate many things, but not the smell of failure. Outside the palace, the people of France were fed a different story. Official reports were optimistic. The king was said to be recovering, exhausted, but improving. Bulletins printed in the royal press emphasized his piety, his courage, his concern for the realm. The public did not know that their king could barely speak, that his flesh was falling away, or that worms had begun to infest the open sores on his leg. They didn't know that Louis XIV was decomposing while still alive. The clergy moved to preserve the image of the king as a Christian monarch making a noble exit. They exaggerated his devotions, downplayed his agony. Confessors encouraged public prayers and arranged processions. But within the palace, even the priests began to grow uneasy. Some found the scenes too grotesque to reconcile with sacred dying. One chaplain reportedly left the chamber mid-blessing, unable to mask his revulsion. The king himself noticed the absence. The courtiers who once clung to his every breath now found excuses to stay away. The once grand chamber was quieter. He was still the king, yes, but he was no longer a force. He was a memory in the making. And memory, as Louis would soon learn, is shaped not by the dying, but by the living who remain. So as his body collapsed, the machine of monarchy kept grinding forward. Scribes documented the regency protocols. Guards practiced the funeral procession. Tailors prepared the mourning black. Everything was being arranged, not for his survival, but for the performance that would follow his death. Louis XIV had ruled France as an immortal myth. But myths, when they falter, are swiftly replaced. The morning of September 1st, 1715, began like the many that had come before it. Thick with incense, shadowed by velvet curtains, and pierced by the whimpers of a dying man. Louis XIV had been unconscious for hours, drifting in and out of a fevered haze. His pulse was faint, his skin clammy, his body bloated with rot. The gangrene had consumed his leg entirely, reaching up through the hip and into the abdomen. The flesh was discolored and splitting, giving way to glistening necrotic tissue. His abdomen was swollen like a drum. His breathing reduced to shallow, rattling gasps. Doctors, helpless and humiliated, stood by in ceremonial silence. They had no more remedies to offer. Leeches, poultices, enemas, all had failed. His body had become a battleground of conflicting humors and unchecked infection, a monarchical corpse in progress still breathing out of stubborn defiance. Only a handful remained at his bedside. His confessor, a few loyal servants, and the regency officials who had been instructed to witness the moment of death. A child's silver cross was placed near his fingers. Someone whispered the last rites. And then came the final breath, gurgling, shallow, and long. His chest rose, collapsed, and stilled. The man who had ruled France with absolute authority for 72 years, who had built Versailles, drained the state treasury with wars and pageantry, and styled himself as the living image of divine order, was now dead flesh on a linen sheet. There was no halo, no divine light, only a body that oozed. When they moved him, fluid leaked from the sores. The leg, blackened and stiff, cracked audibly as they shifted it. One servant retched. Louis XIV's corpse was quickly placed on a cooling slab doused in vinegar, while the embalmers debated how to preserve a body already decomposing. The king had once ordered elaborate funeral ceremonies for his predecessors, but his own was becoming a race against stench and rot. His face, in the hours following death, began to swell and darken. His mouth hung partially open, his tongue swollen. Portraits were hastily covered. Drapes were drawn. The palace entered mourning, but not silence. There were plans to implement, power to transfer. Despite the physical horror of his death, Louis's final moments offered one note of haunting clarity. Days before he passed, barely able to speak, he summoned his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, to his bedside. In a voice ravaged by illness and trembling with regret, he said, "Do not imitate me in my love for building, nor in my love of war. Live in peace with the nations. Relieve the burdens of your people." It was the voice of a man who knew, at last, what absolute power cannot escape: the judgment of history and the inevitability of death. By nightfall, Louis XIV, once the brightest star in Europe, was cold, discolored, and leaking. The embalming failed to halt the decay. His body would rot so rapidly that within days, the funeral procession had to use perfume-soaked cloths to keep horses from panicking at the smell. His reign had been about image, performance, and permanence, but his death stripped all that away. In the end, There were no more courtiers, no more divine titles. There was only a man, alone in the dark, swallowed by the very flesh he once adorned in gold. The France that awoke on September 2nd, 1715 did not mourn in confusion. It mourned on cue. The official bulletin read like poetry. His Majesty expired peacefully, surrounded by his household, having received the sacraments, and submitting his soul with grace to the will of God. No mention of the gangrene, no mention of screams or leaking flesh, no mention of the worms found near the foot of the deathbed. Louis XIV's death, in its public telling, was an immaculate act of Christian departure, a pious king crossing gently into the arms of heaven. The state machinery, ever loyal to image, moved swiftly to replace rotting truth with immortal myth. In Versailles, tapestries were changed. Portraits of the king were rehung, always showing him in youth or military triumph, never as an old man in decline. Official artists were forbidden from depicting the Sun King's final weeks. Sketches made by eyewitnesses were quietly seized or destroyed. Even the embalming records, grim inventories of bodily decay, were edited before entering the archives. The word gangrene was nearly erased from the narrative, replaced with phrases like fever or natural decline. The stench of decomposition that haunted his room, rewritten as the faint odor of incense. His death mask, long rumored to have been distorted by swelling and disfigurement, was never displayed. What remained was not the corpse, but the curated legacy. This was not merely propaganda, it was royal theology. Louis had spent his reign building himself into a god-king, a political sun around which France revolved. To admit that he had died in agony, rotting from the inside, was to threaten the very myth that upheld monarchy. So the court worked quickly. Funerary ceremonies were filled with orchestrated grandeur. Black velvet drapes, solemn chants, and golden effigies. The public was invited to witness the majesty of it all, never suspecting the truth that had been scrubbed clean by perfume and protocol. The funeral sermon, delivered at St. Denis, presented Louis as a sacred figure, chosen by God, burdened with divine duty, ascending in glory. The orator, Massillon, famously opened not with praise, but with a chilling line, Dieu seul est grand. Only God is great. Even in that moment, there was a subtle rebellion against the myth, a quiet acknowledgement that even the greatest king must bow to something greater. But that thought was quickly buried beneath ceremony and pageantry. The monarchy, even as it transformed into the hands of a child, clung to the illusion of continuity and sanctity. The real Louis XIV, the man who wept, who begged for more opium, who hallucinated his dead children, was gone. And in his place stood a statue, an icon, a carefully rewritten death. His diaries, if they held personal reflections or confessions, were sealed. His private letters, some of them containing signs of self-doubt in his final months, were lost in the royal archives. In their place, memoirists produced volumes extolling his wisdom, his patience, his faith. The great irony was this: Louis XIV, who had controlled every image of himself in life, had that same control imposed upon his memory in death. The grotesque had been cleaned. The human had been embalmed beneath legend. And history for a time believed it. The Sun King once declared, "L'état c'est moi. I am the state." And for decades it seemed true. His will was law. His body was symbol. His reign was legend. But death does not recognize legend. His life was a monument to power, crafted in gold and marble, drenched in incense and ceremony. But his death was a collapse of flesh, a slow, humiliating defeat not by enemies, but by nature itself. The irony was almost poetic. The man who had shaped France into a reflection of himself could not shape the final image of his own body. In that moment, all titles and illusions fell away. No Sun King, no divine right, just rotting meat and silence. Yet from that silence, a deeper truth emerges, one that transcends monarchy, even history itself. Louis XIV's death reminds us that power does not preserve, and glory does not grant escape. No matter how grand the architecture, how vast the empire, or how obedient the subjects, the body returns to the earth. The story is told, yes, but often rewritten, sanitized, adorned. And so we are left with a dual image. The king who ruled as a god, and the man who died like anyone else. One fed the myth, the other reveals the truth. Philosophers have a term for this, memento mori. Remember that you must die, not as a warning, but as an invitation, to confront the illusion of permanence, and in doing so, find clarity. Louis XIV's legacy still stands, in the palaces, the archives, the art. But it is his death, not his life, that most nakedly reveals the human condition. In the end, the sun did not vanish. It rotted, and the world went on.